Okay.
Well, enjoy your lunch.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I on? Sounds like it. It is our pleasure this afternoon to have two of the world's leading authorities on fluoridated water supplies and the evils thereof. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Paul Connett. He has spent the last 16 years researching the effects of fluoride on human health and the environment. He is the executive director of the Fluoride Action Network, a nonprofit coalition of citizens and scientists working to broaden awareness about the toxicity of fluoride compounds and the harmful consequences of community water fluoridation. Dr. Connett is a co-author of The Case Against Fluoride, How Hazardous Waste Ended Up in Our Drinking Water, and the Bad Science and Powerful Politics That Keep It There. I can assure you that his sentences while he talks to you will not be as long as that one I just read. He holds a BA in Natural Sciences from Cambridge University in England, and his speech is accompanied by that accent, I might add, and a PhD in Chemistry from Dartmouth College. Dr. Connett is retired from his full professorship at St. Lawrence University, Canton, New York, where he taught environmental chemistry and toxicology for 23 years. And I might add he has a son who is equally involved in the case against community water fluoridation. Without further introduction, Dr. Paul Connett.
Thank you, Charles, very much indeed. It's a family affair. My wife got me into this 16 years ago. And my son, Michael, as Charles mentioned, is very much a mainspring of our information. He is the mastermind behind our webpage. I hope you can all see these screens because this seems to be rather faint to me. So thank you all for coming and giving up your lunchtime, although you're getting lunch, so that's good. And Albert is here, and Albert, if you don't mind, perhaps you can join in at the question time and be ready to buttress my answers. You know, this morning I was thinking about the way that the paper ran an editorial, supposed to be in an article, but it turned out to be an editorial a couple of days ago, intimating essentially that Wichita is behind the times, that it's about time they caught up with all those magnificent cities in the United States that fluoridate the water. And I thought, what about the magnificent cities, the very famous cities, which are overwhelming in the majority that don't fluoridate their water? And you can do the same thing. I started to make a list alphabetical of all the cities that don't fluoridate their water and how I would like to be in that group rather than the group of American cities. You have, for example, Athens, you have Amsterdam, you have Belgrade, you have Brussels, you have Bonn, you have Berlin, you have Cambridge, you have Edinburgh, you have Frankfurt, you have Genoa, you have Florence, you have Rome, you have Stockholm, you have Oslo, you have Vienna, you have Venice. You could go on and on. All of the famous cities in Europe essentially are not fluoridated. Only 3 countries in Europe have any fluoridation at all. One is Spain, with about 10% of the population drinking fluoridated water. One is Ireland, that has mandatory fluoridation thanks to American pressures. And they have 73% of the population drinking fluoridated water, and 10% of England. The rest of Europe does not drink fluoridated water. So, as you heard from Charles, I spent 16 years researching this issue, and this effort, the culmination of this effort, resulted in this book, The Case Against Fluoride. And the big, there are some of the cities that I pulled out this morning that don't fluoridate their water. And the best decision I made in 16 years on this issue was choosing two co-authors, James Beck and Speddy Micklem, who really got the tone right. We decided from the word go, we wouldn't overstate the case, we would understate it, we wouldn't treat our opponents with the same kind of disdain and rudeness that we get treated with. No name-calling, just focus on the arguments, and every argument and fact was backed up with the literature. In fact, there are 80 pages of references to the scientific literature. We had hoped that this would raise the level of the debate, that the proponents would respond in kind and write some critique of our book. But after 2 years, there has been no scientific response to our book from the promoters of fluoridation. They've chosen to do what they normally do, which is to ignore any scientific information which challenges their practice. They continue to maintain, despite not responding scientifically to our scientific arguments, they continue to maintain their mantra that fluoridation is safe and effective. I've now come to the conclusion that they must get some kind of royalty. Every time they use the words safe and effective in public, they, ching ching, another $100 goes into their outfit. Worse still, fluoridation promoters continue to malign the integrity of those who oppose fluoridation. And I was shocked to see that little video clip when Dr. William Mars was here and was asked by one of you to debate me. And he refused, claiming something to the effect that I was a masterful debater and he wasn't. But it was worse because he went on to suggest that I was the leader of misinformation on fluoridation. And I thought that was outrageous. You don't have to be a good debater. If your opponent has been producing a lot of misinformation, all you have to do is to produce that misinformation in the debate and you win. Now, Dr. William Mars heard my presentation to the National Research Council on October the 3rd, 2003. He was there. He gave a presentation for 45 minutes, which was excruciatingly boring. But then I gave my presentation for 45 minutes. I challenged Dr. Mars to tell me where I misinformed the National Research Council. Also, I challenged Dr. Mars to give me the misinformation in my book and to give us the misinformation on our webpage. That would be the way to respond, not just to attack your opponent and then run from cover. And that, I'm afraid, is typical. This has been shadowboxing for 16 years. They won't publicly debate you. It's very rare to get a debate. I did get one in Phoenix, Arizona, a couple of months back, but it's very rare. Instead, they conduct their battle from safe territory. They give one-sided presentations at public hearings, one-sided interviews on the radio and so on, everywhere where they can't be challenged on their facts. And they have to do it that way because, quite frankly, they do not have the science on their side. So some of the key arguments against fluoridation. It's a poor medical practice to use the water supply to deliver medicine because, for obvious reasons. I'm sorry. One, you can't control the dose. Ask any pharmacist if there's any drug that you can give to patients and tell them to take as much as you want, whenever you want. Can't do it. Ask him or her if there's any drug that you can give to everybody, regardless of their age, regardless of their medical status, their nutritional status. He would laugh in your face. It also, of course, as you well know, violates the individual's right to informed consent to medication. That's a very important right. The American Medical Association has a long description of what that entails on its website. And basically, what we're allowing to happen, and what could happen in Wichita if we're not vigilant, is that the community will do to everyone what a doctor can do to no one. A doctor cannot force you to take medication. But once you put it in the water, you're forcing people, especially families on low income, to take this stuff into their bodies. Worse still, it's not a nutrient. There's not a single process in the body that's ever been demonstrated to require need fluoride to function properly. And that includes all the organs in the body. Not one single process needs fluoride. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that fluoride can interfere with some fundamental biological processes. It's nasty stuff from a biological point of view because it inhibits enzymes, it interferes with G proteins, it possibly interferes with oxidative stress and so on. There are many places where fluoride can cause harm. What we say in England is you're on a hiding to nothing to swallow fluoride. It can't do any good and it could possibly do you harm. You're on a hiding to nothing. How big that hiding is, well, is being revealed daily from studies being done in other countries. Now, the giveaway for me 16 years ago when I started to read the literature is that the fluoride level in mother's milk is so extremely low. When you consider what mother's milk is, the first meal that a baby gets, designed to provide for that baby everything it needs for healthy development. The only problem here is that the mother may not have good nutrition herself, so under those circumstances she can't pass on minerals and she can't pass on vitamins which she herself is not taking in. But assuming the mother is getting a decent diet, then that's the best meal that we can give to our babies. And the notion that dentists in Chicago, the ADA, know more about what the baby needs than nature herself is absolutely preposterous. It's arrogant, as is most of this practice, an arrogant practice. But the result is that a bottle-fed baby in a fluoridated community is getting 250 times more fluoride than a breastfed baby. And that's not a good thing to do. It's reckless. Now we know, at the least, and they don't deny it, that fluoride interferes with the infant's growing tooth cells, causing a condition called dental fluorosis. They don't deny that. But according to the CDC, 41% of American children aged 12 to 15, including those who live in non-fluoridated communities, have this condition, some form of dental fluorosis. And according to the CDC from 2005, black and Mexican American children have higher rates of dental fluorosis than white children. Here's the paper on which these statistics are based. Here you see the very mild is the third columns along. 28.5% of American children aged 12 to 15 have very mild dental fluorosis. 8.6% have mild dental fluorosis, and 3.6% have moderate or severe dental fluorosis. And to give you some idea what it looks like, this is very mild. Very mild, in its mildest of the very mild is white specks on the cusp of the teeth. But it can go up to 25% of the tooth surface, and this is a child at the other end of the spectrum as far as very mild dental fluorosis. 28.5% of American children now have that condition, age 12 to 15. Mild dental fluorosis impacts 50% of the tooth surface, and 8.6% of American children aged 12 to 15 have that. And moderate or severe dental fluorosis impacts 100% of the tooth surface, and with severe, with chipping and so on. And that impacts 3.6% of American children. Now, to put this into historical perspective, when they started this, when Dean first published his studies and said that 1 part per million is the optimal level for fluoridation, he assumed that only 10% of American the children that drank fluoridated water, 10% would get dental fluorosis, but only in its very mild condition. As I said, now we have 41%. So the practice has failed on one tenet. One tenet was to reduce tooth decay whilst keeping dental fluorosis at a reasonable, non-recognizable level. Absolute failure. 41% of kids now are overexposed to fluoride. This is what Pam Dembeston wrote in an interview in the Scientific American. She's important. She's one of the leading researchers on dental fluorosis. She's a dentist. She said, "We can certainly see that fluoride impacts the way proteins interact with mineralized tissue. So what effect is it having elsewhere at the cellular level? Fluoride is very powerful, and it needs to be treated respectfully. Putting it in the drinking water and allowing people to drink as much as they want, regardless of their condition, is not treating fluoride with any respect at all. This is what Arvid Carlsson said. He was the scientist that led the successful campaign against fluoridation in Sweden. And in 1978, this is a long time ago, he said, "One wonders what an increase in the exposure to fluoride, such as occurs in infants, bottle-fed with fluoridated water diluted preparations, may mean for the development of the brain and the other organs." Now, he was interested in the brain. He's a neuropharmacologist. That's what he won his Nobel Prize for. But that was a very prophetic statement. It was issued about 20 years before the first animal studies and human studies came in to show that fluoride damaged the brain. I should be talking about that more in a moment. In my view, it is reckless to assume that when fluoride is damaging the infant's growing tooth cells, it's not damaging other tissues. That's reckless from a biochemical point of view. You just can't assume that. And that's what they did in 1950. When the US government endorsed fluoridation in 1950, that's the assumption that they made. You could cause dental fluorosis without damaging any other tissue. A reckless gamble. There's several lines of evidence indicate today that fluoride can damage the brain, the bone, and other tissues. In fact, you know, there's no argument whatsoever that fluoride damages the brain, damages the bone, damages the endocrine system. No argument at all. The only argument is whether the levels that we get from fluoridated water damage the bone, the brain, and other tissues. We know from India and China and other countries that have high natural levels of fluoride that fluoride has ruined the health of millions of people. So, again, a reckless issue, reckless to put it into the mouths of babies. The benefits of swallowing fluoride have been wildly exaggerated. Even fluoridation proponents now concede that fluoride's beneficial action is predominantly topical, not systemic. That's what the CDC conceded in 1999, and when it did so, it should have been the end of fluoridation, period. There are many places where fluoridation should have been stopped. It should never have started, but there are many times when it should have been stopped, and that was one of them. It just defies common sense. When you have topical treatments readily available in the form of toothpaste, etc., to swallow it and expose all the tissues to the body to this toxic substance and to people that don't want it, it's silly. And it probably explains why it's been so difficult to establish any difference in tooth decay between kids that are grown up in a fluoridated country or a fluoridated community and a non-fluoridated community or country. The next argument is the chemicals used to fluoridate are not pharmaceutical grade. They're not the same grade as you would put in dental products, but industrial waste products derived from the wet scrubbing systems of the phosphate fertilizer industry. Amongst other toxics, these fluoridating chemicals contain arsenic. What's the significance of that? The answer is that arsenic is a known human carcinogen for which there is no safe level. Even down to one ion, one molecule, arsenic can cause cancer. So inevitably, the result of using industrial-grade chemicals to fluoridate the water will increase cancer rates in the United States, period. You can't challenge that logic. And in addition, fluoride itself may cause cancer. But before you get to that point, the fluoridating chemicals, because they contain known human carcinogens, will increase cancer rates in the United States. No one's measuring. They don't care. The science underpinning promoters' claims of safety and effectiveness is extremely poor. I'll give you 4 examples of bad science. Number 1, There's not been a single randomized clinical trial demonstrating either fluoridation's effectiveness or safety. That's what the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, requires for any new drug. Now you can understand why the FDA has never approved fluoride for ingestion. They've never done the trials. They've never demonstrated this. The FDA washed its hand of this issue many years ago, which is totally irresponsible. Why taxpayers continue to pay for this entity, it amazes me. In the 16th, I mean, we're talking about the most prescribed medicine in US history, and it's never been regulated or by the FDA. Give me a break. In the 60s, I was at college with John Cleese, you know, Monty Python fan, and sometimes I feel I'm trapped. I've been trapped for 16 years in a series of episodes of Monty Python, because it'd be hard to invent this stupidity.
American politics.
Absolutely. In the 67 years since fluoridation began, there's been little or no monitoring of fluoride levels in the bone. You know, even though we've known for years that about 50% of the fluoride accumulates in our bones. And from studies in India, we know that the symptoms associated with poisoning of the bones is like arthritis. And even though we have millions of people with arthritis, we've never systematically tracked the bone levels of fluoride in people that have lived in fluoridated communities 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Same with the blood, same with the urine. No tracking, no monitoring. It's almost as if these people have determined that God, despite our recklessness, despite our stupidity, is going to protect us every step of the way. There's no need to throw in a little speck, a little microgram of science into this. No. This is safe and effective. Those are two examples. Third example. Even where harm has been demonstrated in countries with high natural levels, what a luxury we have. What a luxury we have to have places in China, villages in China, which differ by only one thing, the level of fluoride in the water. Everything else is the same occupation, same diet, same lifestyle, same schooling, same everything that you can think of, except for one thing, fluoride in the water. It's a wonderful place to do epidemiology. The Chinese are doing it. Our problem is we completely ignore their results. Why? And even though it's well established that the severity of dental fluorosis is a biomarker of how much overexposure to fluoride the child had before their permanent teeth have erupted, giving us a wonderful tool for epidemiology. I mean, you've got the x-axis, right? The x-axis is very mild dental fluorosis, moderate dental fluorosis, severe dental fluorosis, millions of children in each category. Now what should we look at in children? Lowered IQ, earlier onset of puberty, attention deficit syndrome. You could go on, all the bone fractures, many things that we could be investigating right now in terms of what this fluoride exposure may be causing. Have we done that? I believe there's one study in the United States that looked at some condition as related to dental fluorosis. Incredible. Incredible. It's embarrassing. That's the title of my thing. When people look back on this, and imagine interviewing a doctor a few years from now, a scientist a few miles, forget the dentist, the doctors and the scientists and say, what were you doing? Put this known toxic substance in the drinking water of over 200 million Americans every day. What were you doing? Why did you let it happen? Oh, well, the AMA said it was okay. The fifth example of bad science is plain to see here in Wichita. As I mentioned before, promoters have always maintained that at 1 part per million, 10% of the kids would develop dental fluorosis, and in the very mild category. Now we know that kids are getting fluoride from other sources, and the average is about 41%. However, this means If you wanted to be scientific right now, before they'd gone 1 second into promoting fluoridation in Wichita, they should have done a survey of the dental fluorosis rates in Wichita. Because if the result came back over 10%, then clearly your kids are already getting the optimal amount of fluoride. And what you would have got probably is somewhere between 30, 40, maybe even 50% of the kids have dental fluorosis right now. So the conclusion is, God, our kids are being overexposed to fluoride already. We shouldn't be giving them any more. That would be scientific, would it not? That would be what a scientist would do to do this. But science doesn't count in this. We have the science on our side in abundance. They have the power. And they have the power to do some stupid things. So they haven't attempted to put this on a scientific basis. Instead of science, promoters use endorsements. This is typical. This is the list of all the agencies that are supposed to endorse fluoridation. The ADA says that all these organizations endorse fluoridation, but how many of them have researched the issue for themselves? And how many have done this recently? How many, for example, have reviewed the studies on fluoride and the brain? Very, very few. And endorsements are a good way to sell shoes, but not a good way to determine public health policy. This is not put it to the vote. This is, where's the science? Where's the science which has convinced you that fluoridation works? Where's the science which convinces you beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is safe? They can't produce that. Many Americans might find these endorsements impressive, but they clearly did not work with Europe, where the vast majority of countries which have similar bodies to those have rejected fluoridation. Here, 97% of the population of Western Europe does not drink fluoridated water. Look at those countries. They've got some good scientists there, some good professional bodies. 4 of them use fluoridated salt. But the overwhelming majority neither fluoridate their water nor their salt. Fluoridating the salt gives the individual some control, some freedom of choice in this matter. So when they say, don't worry about Europe, example, because they have other ways of delivering fluoride, poppycock. Most of them don't put fluoride in the water or their salt. But according to the World Health Organization, they have a database on this, tooth decay in 12-year-olds has been coming down as fast in the fluoridated countries as the non-fluoridated. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 of these countries are not fluoridated. A couple started fluoridation and stopped, Netherlands and Switzerland. United Kingdom has 10% fluoridation. So 13 non-fluoridated, and 1, 2, 3, 4 fluoridated. And you'll notice tooth decay in 12-year-olds has been coming down dramatically in all these countries, regardless of whether they're fluoridated or non-fluoridated. And if you look at the tooth decay figures now in 12-year-olds from the 2000 on, it's a wash. You can't tell the difference. Now, the most frequently cited endorsement of fluoridation comes from the CDC. Hardly a day goes by without some journalist, editor, or health official citing this quote from the Center of Disease Control. Now, before you have an instant orgasm over the fact that the CDC is going to tell you something, I should put this into context. The CDC is 20,000 employees in Atlanta, Georgia, and they have all the skills imaginable, expertise in every medical thing, risk assessment, and so on. But there's only 30 people in the whole of the CDC that have anything to do with fluoridation. The only people that say anything on fluoridation is the Oral Health Division, which was headed up by none other than Dr. William Mars. This is his practice he's defending right here. Now, these 30 people, one, are dentally trained. They're nearly all dentists. And number two, they have an agenda. They promote fluoridation. So it's a circular argument when they tell you as follows: fluoridation is one of the top 10 great public health achievements of the 20th century. This is just puffing up their own promotion of fluoridation. But it's treated as if this 20,000 body went down and looked at all the health studies and all the benefit studies and concluded after minuscule analysis that this was the best thing we've ever done. However, the report on which this statement was based was not externally peer-reviewed. It appeared in the Mortality and Morbidity Weekly Report, which is an in-house journal of the CDC, not externally reviewed. It's a journal that they put out their policy statements and so on. Worse, it was written by just two people: Scott Tomar, a dentist who had not written anything on fluoridation before, and Susan Griffin, an economist. Okay, well, not exactly what you'd want to support your statement that's going to go worldwide, is it? However, there are many citizens who go out there, study the literature very carefully, and they do a good job. So I'm not going to just say, because it was only two people and they weren't very qualified, that we should ignore them. No, they could have done a decent job. In actual fact, they did a lousy job. On health, they were 6 years out of date on the health. They only cited one article to support the notion that there were no health problems, and that was the National Research Council report of 1993. So they were 6 years out of date on the health literature when they made this statement. And the evidence of benefit was laughable. Look at this. There's only one figure in their whole report. And this shows tooth decay in 12-year-olds, the mean DMFT, decayed, missing and filled teeth. The tooth decay in 12-year-olds coming down from the 1960s through to the 1990s. And on the same graph, they had the percentage of the US population drinking fluoridated water going up by a few percentage points. And they said, voila, this is coming down because that is going up. Well, so was the sale of bicycles and telephone directories, and many other things were going up at the same time as tooth decay was coming down. And so they are guilty of the common mistake of a confusing association with cause and effect. It happens all the time, but you would think it would be pretty elementary for an organization like the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, would you not? Not to fall for such a trap. But worse still, if they had checked with the World Health Organization, they would have found that all these other countries which are not fluoridated, the tooth decay was coming down as fast. This is the red line. This is the American line. So, in my view, to state that this line is coming down because the percentage of the population drinking fluoridated water has gone up is either utter incompetence. In other words, they didn't know that this whole database was there to compare, or it was deception. They did know that that database was out there, but they stooped to propaganda rather than sticking to science. You choose. Was it incompetence or was it propaganda? Instead of science, promoters used dummy reviews by hand-picked panels of pro-fluoridation experts. This is what the authors of the book, The Fluoride Wars, this is Freeze and Layer. And this book is largely pro-fluoridation, but they did acknowledge this. They said anti-fluoride forces have always claimed that the many government-sponsored review panels set up over the years to assess the costs and benefits of fluoridation were stacked in favor of fluoridation. A review of the membership of the various panels confirms this charge. Well, thank you, Freeze and Lear. Let's read on. Read on. The expert committees that put together reports by the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1941, 1944, and 1954, the National Academy of Sciences in 1951, 71, 97, and 1993, the World Health Organization in 1958 and 1970, and the U.S. Public Health Service in 1991 are rife with the names of well-known medical and dental researchers who actively campaigned on behalf of fluoridation or whose research was held in high regard in the pro-fluoridation movement. Membership was interlocking and incestuous. So thank you, Fries and Leah, for agreeing with us that you have to take with a pinch of salt reviews when the panel has been handpicked by a government that's pro-fluoridation. Now, I'll give you some recent examples. The Center for Disease Control report of '99, Fluoridation Forum in Ireland, probably the worst review of the literature ever undertaken, the most biased. I think out of 280 pages, they spent 1.5 pages on original health studies. The National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia, 2007, Health Canada, 2011. And I want to draw your attention to prove what Fries and Leah said. Look at this. A recent example is Health Canada. They picked a pro-fluoridation panel which was embarrassing. They picked a panel of 6 experts to review the literature on the safety of fluoridation. 4 of these 6 experts were dentists known to be pro-fluoridation. There they are, Jay Kumar from New York, avid pro-fluoridation. Chris Clark from BC, avid pro-fluoridation. Stephen Levy from Iowa, who's received millions of dollars of money from the US government to research fluoride, and Michael Levy from Quebec. Can you imagine that in any other field? That you're going to look at a controversial issue like this, which may have health consequences, and you go and choose 4 out of your 6 panelists are pro-fluoridation dentists who are going to review the literature for you. Look what they said about IQ. These 6 experts, after reviewing the literature on fluoride and IQ, declared that, quote, the weight of evidence indicated that there was no problem. What weight of evidence? Remember this, I'm going to come back to this slide a few slides from now, because I'm going to go through the evidence. Let's look at the real science. One of the few examples of a review which involved a balanced panel was the National Research Council. If there's been one moment where science has suddenly been taken seriously, it was that moment. For whatever reasons, they chose a panel which was balanced. They had 3 experts who were anti-fluoridation, 3 that were pro-fluoridation, and 6 who hadn't declared a position. And they spent 3.5 years coming up with this document, Fluoride in Drinking Water, a scientific review of EPA's standards, drinking water standards. It took them 3.5 years. They expected to do it in 1 year. They took them 3.5 years. The final review was 507 pages long with 1,100 references. And I'm glad to say that much of what I told them when I testified was vindicated in those pages. On the day the NRC report was released, the very day, the ADA declared that it was irrelevant to water fluoridation, erroneously claiming that the NRC panel concerned itself only with water containing fluoride at 4 parts per million. Utter nonsense. There was no restriction made by the NRC on what levels of fluoride they studied. None at all. 6 days later, Tweedledum to Tweedledee, the Oral Health Division of the CDC, which is like an adjunct of the ADA, declared, no, seriously, you'll find the ADA will make a statement today and the CDC will make a similar statement a few days later. The findings of the NRC report are consistent with the CDC's assessment that water is safe and healthy at the levels used for water fluoridation. How could either of these bodies, with a straight face, make that statement? How could they make that statement if they'd read the report. Look at Chapter 2. Chapter 2 was an exposure analysis. The panel estimated how much fluoride people in different subsets of the population were getting. And they concluded that several subsets, including bottle-fed babies, were already exceeding the EPA's safe reference dose, drinking fluoridated water at 1 part per million. It also included high water drinkers, people with diabetes, etc., etc., etc. So subsets already exposing over getting more fluoride than the safe reference dose. So how could you say drinking fluoridated water? So how could they say it wasn't relevant to water fluoridation? Again, lousy science, powerful politics. For 16 years, my major concern has been fluoride's potential to damage the brain. If you go back to the first thing I wrote 16 years ago, it very much focused on the study that had come out from Phyllis Munonix and the first 2 IQ studies from China. In my view, fluoride today is where lead was in the 1970s as far as its potential to impact the developing brain. This is what the NRC concluded. It is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain. What if we stopped there? What if we said, we're putting this stuff into the drinking water of 200 million Americans with no control over dose, and the NRC tells us that this substance that we're putting in has the potential to interfere with the functions of the brain? You'd have to be pretty reckless to continue just on that statement alone. But let's do more. There's much more. Now, at the time that the NRC did this review, there were only 5 IQ studies published. One of them was by Jiang. Now, this one, Jiang is important to me. Albert's met him several times. He invited me to go to China. He works for the Center of Disease Control in China. Center for Disease Control in China is trying to get fluoride out of the water. Center for Disease Control in the US, Oral Health Division, trying to put it in. So I visited the 2 villages where he did the study. One village was less than 0.7 parts per million in their water, and the other one was 2.5 to 4.5 parts per million. This is the only obvious difference between those villages. As I said before, same lifestyle, same housing, same occupations, same diet, etc. Now, he controlled for lead exposure and iodine intake and other key variables. And they found a drop of 5 to 10 IQ points across the whole age range, and the drop in IQ correlated with fluoride levels in the urine, which is a measure of individual exposure. And the whole IQ curve was shifted for both males and females. Here's the male curve. So here's the low fluoride village, less than 0.7, and here's the high fluoride village. The whole curve has been shifted over. That is significant in population terms, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. He estimated that the threshold for lowering of IQ was 1.9 parts per million. And in a very simple way, we can say right now that fluoridating water at 1 part per million offers no protection for all children's mental development, because an American child drinking 2 liters of water at 1 part per million, 1 part per million is 1 milligram per liter, so you get 2 liters, you get 2 milligrams a day. That's your dose. That is higher than one of those Chinese children drinking 1 liter of water at 1.9 parts per million. So based upon that level, there's no margin of safety. And that ignores another factor, which is you're dealing with a few hundred Chinese children. Do you think that you've got the potential range of sensitivity for children in the whole of America's population based upon 300 Chinese children? They've all got the same genetics for a start. We're dealing with a heterogeneous population here, different genes, different lifestyles, different health status, vastly different. And normally when you're extrapolating from a result in toxicology where you found harm in a small study, you apply a safety factor of 10 to protect everybody in society. It's called the intraspecies variation. Intraspecies safety factor. You assume that some children in the population are going to be 10 times more sensitive than the children in the study group. That's to be conservative, to be protective. So, as I say, you don't even have to apply that safety factor to, when it comes to dose. They're already getting more. If you apply the safety factor, then fluoridation of water at 1 part per million is utterly ridiculous, reckless. More IQ studies. As of 2012, October, this month, there are now 34 published studies from China, India, Iran, and Mexico indicating that fluoride exposure is associated with lowered IQ in children. There's the web page if you want to go to it. You can just go to fluoridealert.org, and one of the mastheads is intelligence. Just click on that and you'll get all this data. Or every single study is reproduced. You can read every single study. Then, a few months back, there's a team from Harvard led by Choi, but including Philip Grandjean, who's very well known, environmental toxicologist, epidemiologist. They did a meta-analysis of 27 of the studies of IQ. And all these studies had the same study. They compared the IQ of children in a high fluoride village versus a low fluoride village. The study was published in Environmental Health Perspectives. That's important. That is the leading environmental health journal in the United States, if not the world. And it's published by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is an entity of the National Institute of Health, talking about putting this right under the nose of the fox. The National Institute of Health, whose policy is fluoridation, here you've got a study published in their own journal saying it may be lowering IQ. Fluoride may be lowering IQ. Best place to put it. You put it in fluoride, everybody ignores it. But in history we'll come back and say the journal Fluoride carried was the flagship for all these studies waving red flags for many, many years. Anyway, what the Harvard team found was 26 of the 27 studies found a lower average IQ in the high fluoride village compared to the low fluoride village. That's a remarkable consistency. Can you consider it? 27 studies from 4 different countries done by different researchers, but they're all coming back and reporting essentially the same thing. 9 of the studies, the so-called high fluoride village, had levels of fluoride less than 3 parts per million. Actually, one was 3.15. So 8 studies were less than 3, 9 studies were 3 or thereabouts. And yet, the Pew Foundation lobby for fluoridation came back and said, oh, the levels that were used there were very high as 11.5 parts per million. Talk about deception. It's true that one of those 27 studies had a range of fluoride. At the high end of the range was 11.5, but the average was nowhere near 11.5. And as I said, 8 were less than 3 parts per million. Now, they found an average lowering of IQ by 0.45 of 1 standard deviation. This is a statistical measurement, the average standardized mean difference. What did Pew do? Pew confused that with IQ points. They said, you don't have to worry about the study because they only found a difference of 0.45 IQ points. No! The standard deviation was 0.45. The average difference was 0.45 of 1 standard deviation on a normal distribution. And that equates to 7 IQ points. And a drop of 5 IQ points is very serious. And they concluded that further investigation of fluoride's lowering of IQ in the US should be a high research priority. Incidentally, the NRC in 2006 also suggested that doing more research on IQ was important. But nothing happened. Nothing happened for 6 years. More research. And Philippe Grandjean said this: fluoride seems to fit in with lead, mercury, and other poisons that cause chemical brain drain. The effect of each toxicant may seem small, but the combined damage on a population scale can be serious, especially because the brain power of the next generation is crucial to all of us. And I'm going to show you some pictures now which illustrate this significant effect on population as opposed to the individual. So this is the normal distribution of IQ. Some children will have a very high IQ in the population. Some children will have a very low IQ. But the famous bell-shaped curve says that most people will have an average IQ. Now, let's see what a shift of 5 IQ points, and the very bright one, see the area under the curve? That green area represents the geniuses in our society. And the mauve area represents the mentally handicapped in our society. Politicians? Yeah, maybe. I wish there was a simple explanation. Anyway, you shift the curve over. Notice you don't make much of a difference to the average person, 100 to 95. And a parent would find it very difficult to distinguish between two siblings, one at 100 and one at 95. Same with a school teacher. You would have to do studies to pull out the significance of that difference. But look what it does to the two tails. A shift of 5 IQ points would halve the number of geniuses in your society and double the number of mentally handicapped. That is serious for our economy. That's serious for our economy and our society. Especially when you get down to here, the cost of treating all those mentally handicapped children and the violence, etc., that may be associated with that is huge. And the cost to our economy of reducing the number of very bright people is huge. More on IQ studies. Ding and others did something slightly different. They didn't compare a high fluoride village with a low fluoride village. They had children drinking different levels of water, and the levels were between 0.3 and 3 parts per million. What they did was to measure the level of fluoride in the urine, which is a measure of exposure. The more you drink, the more that will be in your urine. You can get rid of 50%, the other 50% is in there. So they had a measure of individual exposure, independent of the level in the water. They didn't need to know the level in the water. And they concluded, overall, our study suggested that low levels of fluoride exposure in drinking water had negative effects on children's intelligence. They found that the higher the level of fluoride in the urine, which is a measure of individual exposure to fluoride, the lower the IQ. And the graph that they produced is remarkable. Remarkable relationship here where the drop in IQ is related to the level of fluoride in the urine. The statistics on this are p-value of 0.0001. Highly, highly significant. And Jiang also measured the level of fluoride in the serum. And the same thing, in the high fluoride village, there's a clear relationship between the amount of fluoride in the children's blood and their IQ. Individual exposure. So consider the weight of evidence. I haven't talked about this, but there are over 100 animal experiments that show fluoride damages animal brain. Over 10 animal studies which shows that it changes behavior in the animals. This is important because you've got the animal there, you can control everything except for this chemical, and then you show that the behavior's changed. So don't say this is some psychological factor brought on because they've watched too many TV programs or something, some other extraneous factor. There's nothing else happening to that animal except it's given this fluoride. 4 studies shows that fluoride damages fetal brain. This is from spontaneous abortions in China because they only allow one kid. 34 studies show an association between modest exposure to fluoride and lowered IQ. Another 7 human studies show changes in neurobehavior. That's what we call weight of evidence. Remember I asked you to remember that slide? The 6 experts, after reviewing the literature on fluoride and IQ, declared that the weight of evidence indicated there was no problem. What weight of evidence, I asked? There's the weight of evidence. And if you can conclude, looking at all of that there's nothing to worry about, then you must be a pro-fluoridation dentist. You're certainly not a scientist. So I just want to conclude, because I'm running out of time. This is what Dr. John Dewell did. He's the co-author of one of the most famous books on toxicology in the United States. He was the chairman of the National Research Council. And he said this in an interview in the Scientific American. He says, what the committee found is that we've gone with the status quo regarding fluoride for many years. Far too long, really. And now we need to take a fresh look. In the scientific community, people tend to think this is settled. I mean, when the US Surgeon General comes out and says this is one of the top 10 greatest achievements of the 20th century, that's a hard hurdle to get over. But when we looked at the studies that have been done, we found that many of these questions are unsettled, and we have much less information than we should, considering how long this fluoridation has been going on. Key health studies have not been done in most fluoridated countries. No investigation of a possible relationship between consumption of fluoridated water, lowered IQ in children, behavioral changes in children, arthritic symptoms in adults, hypothyroidism in adults, increased bone fractures in children, melatonin levels in children, earlier onset of puberty, Alzheimer's disease in adults. There is scientific evidence waving red flags in every single one of these issues. It's not, I've just picked them out at random. There's reason for investigating those. Nor has there been an attempt to put on a scientific level the many anecdotal reports and some case studies from Albert's mentor, George Walbot, showing that some people are super sensitive to fluoride, suffer from symptoms which are reversed when the fluoride is taken away from their lives and comes back when it's reintroduced. Bruce Spittle has done a fabulous job summarizing all this evidence in Fluoride Fatigue. And yet, no government that fluoridates its water has made any attempt to look at this scientifically. It just lets these people wallow in complaints with no way of finding out whether they're telling the truth or not. If you don't look, you don't find. The absence of study is not the same as the absence of harm. Instead of science, we're getting politics from both dental and health authorities. I put authorities in inverted commas. Dr. Peter Cooney is the Chief Dental Officer of Canada, and he told an audience in Dryden, Ontario, April the 1st, appropriately, 2008. I was there. It was videotaped, so I'm not making this up. He says, I walked down your high street today, and I didn't see anyone growing horns, and you've been fluoridated for 40 years. I'm happy to tell you, after hearing this astounding piece of information, the citizens of Dryden voted overwhelmingly 2-1 to stop fluoridation. Yeah. And I think that's where I will stop, because we've got to 1 o'clock, and I think you want to ask questions. In future presentations, now I've got some idea how long this takes me, I will try to work in the evidence that it doesn't work. I mean, you could approach this in 2 different ways, can't you? You can say, if it doesn't work, no risk is acceptable at all. If it doesn't work, why are you doing it? I mean, the one tiny little risk should knock it out of the water. On the other hand, you could approach it this way and say, well, we'll assume it works, but if it lowers IQ and causes bone fractures and arthritis and so on, then we shouldn't be doing it. So which do you start with? I choose to start with the health effects and then look at the benefits afterwards. Yes?